20th, 1997 started out as a perfect day for Henry Kiva. The wiry, silver-mustached 76-year-old arrived at the Toyota dealership in Sarasota shortly after dawn. Getting to work early meant that he got first pick of the morning customers, which was how he liked it. By lunch, he'd already made 2 sales, and he was working on his third. And when that third customer signed for her car, Henry handed her the keys and felt that familiar rush of victory. He'd worked plenty of jobs throughout his life, but selling cars was the first thing that he truly loved, and he was really good at it. Henry had an effortless charm and a sort of unthreatening quality that made people trust him. He enjoyed talking to strangers, and he had no plans of slowing down or retiring. Growing up in the Great Depression had imprinted on him a set of unshakable values. He believed that you should work hard, save every dime you can, and treat every day like it's your last. And that mindset had served him well over the years. But life still had come with plenty of setbacks. 2 decades ago, his marriage had fallen apart, and so he'd upended his life and moved from California to Florida. Finding a new job there had been easy with Henry's sales experience, but he had not expected to find love again, too. He'd met his current girlfriend, Janet Scott, a little over 6 years earlier, when Janet had come into Henry's dealership looking to buy a car. She'd left with a car, and also with Henry's phone number. Their relationship quickly progressed from friendly dinners to romance. And Janet never seemed to mind that she was 26 years younger than Henry. She laughed at his jokes, loved his cooking, and put up with his constant car talk. Janet was also a salesperson in her own way. She worked at the Hallmark store at the Sarasota Square Mall, selling cards, chocolates, and stuffed animals. And that day, while Henry was getting ready to sell his third car, Janet was helping a shopper pick out a condolences card for a funeral. As she pulled different options from the rack, Janet couldn't help but feel a twinge of heartache. It was not that long ago that her own mailbox had been flooded with cards like these. Just before she met Henry, her husband, Roe, had died from a heart attack. Janet still wore the diamond engagement ring that Roe had given her, right next to the inexpensive topaz one that Henry had gotten her a few years earlier. She was comfortable in her relationship with Henry, but she knew not to expect a wedding ring from him. Henry had never actually gotten around to filing divorce paperwork for his first marriage, so he was still legally married to his ex in California, and they had 2 adult kids together, a son and a daughter. But Henry hardly ever spoke to his kids these days, which made Janet sad. She'd seen the same thing happen to her late husband. Roe had had an adult daughter from a former marriage, and they'd grown distant after Roe married Janet. Janet thought that Roe had regretted not repairing that relationship before he died, and so she didn't want Henry to die without getting a chance to patch things up with his kids. But she wasn't sure how to help him do that. As upbeat and charming as Henry was, he could also be very private and stuck in his ways. But Janet took a last look at the condolence card her customer chose and resolved to talk to Henry about his kids that night. After purchasing their card, the customer left, and Janet began closing up the store. 20 minutes later, she was driving past sandy white beaches teeming with senior citizens. Sarasota was a magnet for people like Henry, looking to spend their twilight years in the Florida sun. Pretty soon, Janet reached the peaceful neighborhood of Mirror Lake. Janet's spacious one-story house was at the very end of the road, with a red back door looking out to the water. Her late husband, Roe, had lived there with his first family before he met Janet, and then Janet lived there throughout their marriage, and she inherited the place when Roe died. Now, because Roe literally had died in this house, initially, Janet felt hesitant about the idea of letting Henry move in. But Henry had eventually sold her on the idea of him moving in by pointing out how much money they would save if he gave up his apartment. And so he moved in. When Janet walked in the door, she was immediately hit with a delicious smell wafting in from the kitchen. She smiled as she watched Henry move about the kitchen, dashing over for a kiss before hurrying back to the oven. Any discomfort that she might have felt about Henry living here in Roe's old house clearly was not shared. Henry had made himself right at home. After dinner, Janet cuddled on the couch with Henry and her dog Kissy while they watched some local news. And then, around 11 p.m., she remembered her plan to talk to Henry about his kids. But when she looked over at Henry, she could see he was already drifting off to sleep. So Janet switched off the TV and sent her fiancé to bed. The conversation could wait. Janet took Kissy out to the backyard for a quick walk, and then, after coming back inside, she headed to their bedroom, where she removed her rings and set them on the nightstand before climbing into bed beside Henry. The next thing Janet knew, she was dragged from sleep by this blinding pain. And then her surprise gave way to terror when she realized someone was sitting on top of her, pinning her to the bed with their knees while twisting at her neck. Janet started to scream and thrash, but her attacker just punched her repeatedly in the head and chest. Janet tasted blood and started to black out, but she kept struggling, trying to get free. And suddenly, she and her attacker fell off the bed and hit the floor. But before she could get back to her feet, she felt a pull on her legs, and her attacker was right back on top of her, squeezing at her throat. Janet made a final attempt to push her attacker off, but by this point, she was exhausted and disoriented, and slowly, everything went black. Sometime later, Janet woke up on her bedroom floor. Her temple and her throat throbbed with pain, but her attacker was gone. At least they weren't on top of her anymore, and she couldn't see anybody else in the room. Janet lifted her head, trying her best to ignore the pain. She couldn't see much, since it was pitch black in the room and one of her eyes was swollen shut. But as she sat up, Janet heard something, a hoarse, raspy wheezing sound. She didn't know where the sound was coming from or what it could be. All she knew was she needed to get away right now. Painfully, she got up and fumbled through the dark until she found the landline phone on the small vanity table. She picked it up to call the police, but the line was dead. And so Janet left the phone and staggered down the hall and went out the back door. And from there, she headed over to her neighbor's home. When she got there, she desperately banged on the door until her neighbor, a woman named Kathy Peters, answered. And when the neighbor, Kathy, looked out and saw Janet standing there with her shattered face, she was so surprised that she immediately jumped backwards in fright. Janet was actually so bruised and bloodied that Kathy did not recognize her at first. But when she realized who was standing there, she pulled Janet inside, locked the door, and ran to call 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes to take Janet to the hospital, and not a moment too soon. Even as the EMTs loaded her onto the stretcher, she was already losing consciousness again. At almost the same time, several sheriff's deputies arrived at Janet's house. They found the back door unlocked, and so they headed inside. The moment they entered the master bedroom, the deputies knew there had been an extremely violent attack here. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser and dumped all over the floor. There was blood spatter on the blinds and all over the sheets, and a thick puddle of blood was on the floor right where Janet fell. And there, lying on the bed, was Henry. His face was covered in blood, and he had a belt cinched tightly around his neck. The deputies checked him for a pulse, but the man was obviously dead from strangulation. After discovering Henry's body, the deputies began searching the room. One of the deputies was down on his hands and knees, peering under the bed, when he got startled by a pair of eyes staring back at him. It was Janet's dog, Kissy, cowering under the bed, shaking in terror. She refused to come out when the deputy called to her, so he crawled under and pulled her out. Once the deputy had the dog in his arms, it became clear that Kissy was not just terrified. Her eyes were dilated like she had a concussion, and there was some blood around her head, suggesting she had been beaten too. One of the deputies volunteered to take Kissy to a local pet hospital, and as he was leaving with the dog, another car pulled up and two men got out. They were Mark Brewer and Keith Muncy, detectives from the Sarasota Police Homicide Division who would now be taking lead on the case. The two detectives headed inside to join the deputies, who quickly brought them up to speed. Right away, they were struck by the brutality of Henry's murder. He'd been strangled to death with his own belt while he was sleeping, and he'd also been badly beaten. The sheer violence that must have been involved here gave this crime a very personal feeling. The detectives also noticed that while the bedroom had been ransacked, it didn't seem like anything had been taken. For For example, Henry's wallet with some money and credit cards in it was just out on a dresser. And so this made the detectives think that this probably was not a robbery. Next, they checked the landline phone, which was still lying off the hook where Janet had dropped it. The line was dead, so Detective Muncy headed out to the backyard where he confirmed that the phone lines had been cut. He was heading back inside when a flash of white on the ground caught his eye. It was a cigarette butt lying at the edge of the property. And while the grass was wet from some light rain earlier that night, this cigarette butt was dry, meaning it had been dropped within the last few hours. Muncy went inside to share this discovery with Detective Brewer, and after doing so, it would turn out Brewer also had some news of his own. He had found the fingertip of a latex glove in the bedroom. The detectives now had 2 pieces of evidence that might have the killer's fingerprints or DNA material on them. But the lab was backed up, and so testing these items would take time. And so they were hoping that long before they needed the results of those tests, their eyewitnesses could actually just help them solve the crime. So they headed to the hospital to interview the one person, aside from the killer, who was there when Henry was murdered, Janet. Unfortunately, though, when they arrived at the hospital, Janet was unconscious again. And also, one of the doctors warned that with the extent of the injuries she'd sustained, she could actually die. And so Brewer and Muncy were suddenly facing the possibility of a double murder. They asked the hospital staff to call them if Janet woke up. In the meantime, the detectives began digging into Henry's life to try and understand why someone had wanted to kill him. When they got access to his bank accounts, they were surprised by just how much money Henry had put away. Henry sort of gave off the vibe that he was a senior citizen on a limited fixed budget. But in reality, he had $700,000 in the bank. So the detectives speculated that maybe Henry was killed for his money. And their thoughts immediately turned toward Henry's relatives, who were most likely to gain financially from his death. The detectives learned that Henry did not have a will, but that only meant that the bulk of the inheritance would be divided between his adult children, Jeff and Sharon Kiva. When the detectives reached out to Jeff and Sharon, they learned that they were actually already on their way to Sarasota after learning their father had been killed. And at the detectives' request, they agreed to stop by the station to answer some questions. Brewer and Muncy knew it was impossible for Jeff or Sharon to have been present for the murder, since they were across the country in California when it happened. But that did not stop them from potentially arranging a hit through a third party. The detectives pressed the siblings about how they got along with their father, and both Jeff and Sharon said they were on good terms with Henry, but they didn't really talk to him very much. Not because they didn't want to. Jeff clearly idolized his father and had even followed in his father's footsteps to become a car salesman. But they said their father liked his privacy and didn't want many visitors. He seemed happy with the new life he'd built in Florida, so they tried to give him space and let him be. But then Jeff dropped some truly shocking information. A few months earlier, he had called his father at home, and a young man had answered. When Jeff asked who he was talking to, the man said he was Henry's son. Jeff was initially stunned and very confused because he believed he was Henry's only son. But eventually, the truth came out. Soon after Henry had separated from Jeff and Sharon's mother and moved to Florida, he was in a very brief relationship with a woman who gave birth to Henry's other son, David. But Henry never told anybody about David, and Henry himself didn't even meet him until David had grown up and tracked him down. But from what Jeff was able to gather, it seemed like Henry and his son David had seen a lot of each other in the months leading up to the murder. It stung more than Jeff liked to admit, both because Henry had kept David's existence a secret and because he'd been so unavailable to his other kids. Following the conversation with Jeff and his sister Sharon, detectives Brewer and Muncy got to work tracking David down. They learned that he was 20 years old and lived about 3 hours away in the Daytona Beach area. When they contacted him, he agreed to come down to Sarasota for questioning. And during his interview, he admitted that he knew Henry had a lot of money, but didn't know how much or if Henry had a will. David confirmed that he had been spending more time with Henry recently, and that some of the visits had taken place at the house in Mirror Lake, where the murder took place. Most recently, David said he and Henry had watched sports together on TV on Father's Day, which happened to be just 4 days before Henry was killed. All these details made the detectives suspicious of David. After all those years without seeing his father, David was suddenly spending lots of time with him? Was he trying to get Henry's money? Did he secretly nurse a deep grudge against Henry? Either way, David did know his way around Henry's home, and also David was a big man who'd be quite physically capable of strangling a sleeping 76-year-old. David's alibi for the night of the murder was also pretty weak. David told the detectives that he was with his girlfriend that night. And while she did confirm that was true, Brewer and Muncie knew she could just be lying for him. So, ultimately, the detectives pressured David to take a polygraph test. And the results came back inconclusive. Now, of course, polygraph tests are not 100% accurate. I mean, people can lie and they can fake their answers, and a positive result could actually be a negative and vice versa. But at a minimum, an inconclusive test meant that David remained very much a potential suspect. The detectives were still interested in Henry's other two children as well, and Henry's funeral, held about a week after the murder, gave the detectives a chance to observe all three kids together. And right away, Brewer and Muncie could see there was almost palpable tension between David, Jeff, and Sharon. And also, they could overhear very testy conversations between the siblings. At one point, David commented that he was looking forward to buying jet skis with his inheritance. This did not go over well with Jeff, who was already feeling very jealous about Henry spending his last Father's Day with David instead of him, and so he got angry and accused David of being involved in the murder. David walked away before the argument could go any further, and for the remainder of the funeral, the siblings basically avoided each other. The detectives agreed it was not that surprising that the siblings didn't get along. However, them not getting along did not necessarily mean they killed their father. But regardless, Brewer and Muncie decided to still keep an eye on all of Henry's children while they simultaneously dug into his other relationships. The following day, the detectives headed to the Toyota dealership where Henry worked to interview some of his colleagues. And one of Henry's buddies, a guy named Red, was more than happy to help. Red said the other salesmen definitely respected Henry due to his long history in the business, but they also saw him as being pretty old-fashioned and would sometimes give him a hard time about being cheap. They couldn't understand why he wore old, ill-fitting clothes and drove a 10-year-old car when they knew he had money. It was common knowledge around the dealership that Henry had made more than the rest of them put together, just from the number of cars Henry had sold. As one salesman put it, Henry had, quote, more money than God. The detectives jotted all this down and then asked Red if there was anyone on the staff who might have wanted to harm Henry. Red thought for a moment and then told them they should go talk to a guy named Mark. Red explained that Mark was a younger salesman who had worked at the dealership until recently. He was argumentative and lazy and would often miss work, sometimes disappearing for as much as a week at a time. Mark's laziness really rubbed Henry the wrong way, and at one point he had tried to talk some sense into Mark, but Mark just sort of blew him off. And soon after that, Mark was abruptly fired, just a few days before Henry's murder. Now, Red didn't know if Henry had formally complained to management, which sort of led to Mark's firing, but Red said, Henry had been vocal enough about his dislike of Mark that most of the other employees assumed that Henry must have had something to do with Mark's firing. The detectives interviewed more of the salesmen and heard similar stories. Some people thought Mark was actually a drug addict, and that was why he disappeared sometimes. And a few of the salesmen recounted that Mark had been looking for a gun right around the time he got fired. He had told them he needed it to, quote, take care of something. Armed with all these stories, detectives Brewer and Muncie tracked down Mark and brought him into the Sarasota police station for questioning. Mark had a bad attitude right away and acted annoyed at them for wasting his time. While Mark said he did not know anything about Henry's murder, he also said that yes, he and Henry had butted heads. He said that Henry wanted to be treated like the dealership king simply because he'd been there the longest. Mark said that Henry was always butting into other people's business, and as far as Mark was concerned, Henry had gotten what he deserved. Naturally, Brewer and Muncie found this kind of talk extremely suspicious, so they pressed Mark harder. They told him that they'd found a latex glove fragment at the crime scene with fingerprints on it. Now, this was a total bluff on their part. They'd already analyzed that glove fragment and it was clean of prints, but Mark didn't know that. And if he was guilty, thinking that the police had hard evidence could make him crack. But instead, Mark responded somewhat sarcastically, saying that, yeah, finding that glove at the scene would make me a good suspect, because my sister is a nurse, and so I have access to gloves just like that. The detectives thought this was a very strange thing to say, even if it was sarcastic. I mean, Mark was technically incriminating himself in a murder investigation, but Mark just did not seem to care. Brewer and Muncie just sat there, trying to make sense of what Mark had just said, when they got a call from the hospital. Janet was awake, and it looked like she was going to survive. And while she was still weak and in a lot of pain, she had said she was ready to answer their questions. The detectives were so eager to hear from her that they let Mark go for the moment and raced over to the hospital. But when they finally sat down with Janet, it became clear she was not going to be as helpful as they'd hoped. Janet was not just beaten up, she was severely traumatized and confused about what had happened. Doctors said the first thing that she had asked when she regained consciousness was, "Where's Henry?" When Brewer and Muncie gently pressed her to try to focus and remember any details, she tried, but then suddenly got this crushing headache and had to stop. And then a couple of minutes later, when her headache kind of faded, she told them that all she could remember was being beaten and strangled by this faceless dark figure, and then a little bit after that, she remembered waking up on the ground, hearing this horrible rattling wheezing sound. To help jog her memory, Brewer showed Janet some crime scene photos of the bedroom that were taken after the attack. Janet looked closely at all the pictures, but still, she just could not remember anything else. However, she did notice something in one of the photos. Her 2 rings that she had placed on the nightstand were missing. And so at this point, the detectives knew that perhaps the stolen rings indicated that this was a robbery after all. Maybe the killer was planning to take more, but got spooked by the dogs barking and ran. But on the other hand, the fact that just these rings appeared to be missing and that they had sentimental value could point to a personal connection between the killer and the victims. As important as Janet's realization about the rings was, it didn't really provide the detectives with any new clear answers. Their investigation so far had turned up some strong suspects, including Mark, the shady car salesman, and the 3 Kiva children, Jeff, Sharon, and their half-brother David, but as it stood, police did not have enough evidence to build a case against any one of them. So all the detectives could do now was just keep an eye on the suspects and hope that Janet's memory improved. But weeks and then months passed with no progress in the case or any change to Janet's memory, and so the investigation began to go cold. Then, in December of 1997, a full 6 months after Henry's murder, a clue dropped into the detectives' laps that changed everything. In a seemingly unrelated case, Sarasota police deputies responded to a domestic violence call at another house on Mirror Lake, across the water from Janet's place. This was not the first time they'd had to break up a fight at this home. A few months earlier, 39-year-old John Whiteley had pinned his girlfriend, 40-year-old Leela Hodges, between the washing machine and the wall, trapping her there. Leela had forgiven him for that incident, but now he'd attacked her again. And as the police once again separated the couple, John got the impression that he was about to be placed under arrest. And so he shouted that Leela had better keep her mouth shut and not accuse him of anything, or else he would tell them about the rings. Then, as if to prove he wasn't bluffing, he shouted to the deputies, "Hey, you guys want to know something about a murder?" Now, at this point, after John had said all this stuff, the deputies were all thinking of the same thing, Henry's murder case. Now, they all knew that 2 rings had been taken from the crime scene, but that detail had never been made public, which meant this couple, specifically John, might actually know something about Henry's murder. As soon as Detective Brewer and Muncie got word about John and Leela, they were convinced the couple must have had something to do with Henry's murder. They just couldn't figure out how John and Leela were connected to him. So, out of desperation, they decided to go back and talk to Janet one last time. Unfortunately, Janet still could not remember anything more about the attack. So, Brewer and Muncie came up with an idea. They were going to try to hypnotize her. It was unorthodox, but at this point, they were willing to try anything, and Janet was on board. So, the next day, the detectives returned, now with a hypnotist, who put Janet into a trance. And then while she was in her trance, they asked her a series of questions, designed to draw out her repressed memories from the attack. And suddenly, it was like Janet could hear and see things from the night of the attack that she hadn't been able to before. Finally, when the hypnotist asked her to describe her attacker, Janet grew quiet. She still could not picture their face, but she did remember something else. Under hypnosis, Janet recalled waking up to find a large shadowy figure sitting on her thighs while violently grabbing her neck. Janet tried to fight, but it didn't do any good. Then, as the killer continued to throttle her, she became aware of another set of hands on her shoulders. A second person that she couldn't see was holding her to the ground. That meant there were 2 attackers in the bedroom that night, not just one. Janet's revelation stunned the detectives at first, but they quickly realized several of their suspects came in pairs. The first pair was Henry's first set of kids, Jeff and Sharon. They stood to benefit the most from Henry's death, as they knew they would inherit a portion of his small fortune. But that also applied to David, Jeff and Sharon's 20-year-old half-brother. David's girlfriend had provided him with an alibi. Now, the detectives wondered if maybe she'd help David commit the crime, thinking his inheritance would benefit her too, making David and her a pair. The third set of suspects was John and Leela, the couple from the domestic abuse call. While they didn't seem to have a motive, or even really a connection, they lived nearby and seemed to know information that was not shared with the public. The only suspect who did not come with a potential accomplice was Mark, the salesman who was fired days before the murder. While it was still possible that he had killed Henry over a grudge, or maybe as part of a robbery, the detective still had no idea who he would have worked with. That night, after leaving the hospital, Brewer and Muncie holed up in their office and read through the files for each set of suspects, searching for any detail they might have missed. And they were starting to lose steam when Muncie stumbled upon something that made him pause. It was a single word buried in one of the suspect's files. Muncie showed it to Brewer, who immediately jumped to his computer to pull up more details on that suspect. And as his screen filled with information, everything began to fall into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Henry Kiva and Janet Scott on the night of June 20th, 1997. A little before 3 a.m., 2 figures crept along the bank of Mirror Lake. They were wearing black clothes and latex gloves, and the leader was smoking a cigarette. As they reached the edge of Janet's property, the leader put out the cigarette and dropped it into the wet grass. Then the pair hurried across the lawn to the house, where the leader used pliers to cut the phone line that was running along the exterior wall. They found the back door was unlocked, so they slipped inside. Once inside, the accomplice led the way to the master bedroom, where they found Henry and Janet fast asleep in bed. But the couple was not alone. Janet's dog, Kissy, was lying at her feet. When the killers entered, the dog jumped off the bed and began barking. The accomplice stepped forward and delivered a powerful kick that sent Kissy flying against the wall. She fell down and went limp. The killers quickly glanced back over at the bed, and they were relieved to see that Janet and Henry were still asleep. So they moved ahead with their plan. The leader found a pair of pants on the floor, pulled out the leather belt, and then climbed on top of Henry. As Henry began to stir, the leader struck him several times in the face and then wrapped the belt around his neck and began to pull it tight. At the same time, the accomplice jumped on top of Janet and straddled her and began to beat her. Janet woke up and screamed and began fighting as hard as she could to get free, and one of Janet's wild punches caught the accomplice in the nose, causing them to reel back in surprise. and as a result, the accomplice and Janet both tumbled out of the bed onto the floor. By this point, the leader had finished with Henry, so they climbed off the bed and rushed around to help the accomplice. Together, they grabbed Janet and pinned her down, and then the leader climbed on top of her. Then the leader struck her several more times and then wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed. The leader felt Janet go limp, at which point they said, "That should do it," as they climbed off of her. The killers looked at their handiwork and turned to go. On their way out, though, the accomplice spotted Janet's rings sitting on the nightstand, and they recognized one of the rings in an instant, and the sight of it made them furious. So, the accomplice impulsively grabbed both rings and stuffed them into their pocket, then turned and dashed out of the room along with the leader. The killers had only been gone a few minutes when Janet regained consciousness, feeling excruciating pain across her body. She could hear the strange, horrible rattling hiss and didn't know what it could be. Even as she lay there, her mind was already struggling to bury the horrible trauma she had just experienced. That's why she didn't remember until her hypnosis session that she'd actually been attacked by 2 people, and that one of them was actually somebody that she knew. It would turn out the killers were John Whiteley and Leila Hodges, the couple from the domestic abuse call. And just as Brewer and Muncie had suspected, these 2 did have a personal connection to the victims. However, the connection was not really to Henry, it was to Janet. When the detectives reviewed their case file, that single word that stuck out to them was Leila's maiden name. Leila had been married several times and had taken multiple last names, but she'd been born Leila Scott. She was no stranger to Janet. She was Janet Scott's stepdaughter. Leila was the daughter of Janet's late husband, Roe, from his first marriage. She grew up in the house on Mirror Lake where Janet and Henry lived together, and she hated them because she always thought that house should have gone to her when her dad died. Leila felt similarly about Janet's diamond ring. It was the same ring her father had given to his first wife, Leila's mother, which means, all along, the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. Henry was not the primary target of the attack. Janet was. And Leila's deep hatred of Janet explained the brutality of the attack. As a small older man, Henry didn't stand a chance, and Janet was lucky to be alive. She was beaten and choked so badly that her larynx was crushed. That horrible wheezing hiss she heard when she woke up on the floor, that was her own labored breathing. Once Detective Brewer and Muncie put this all together, they had John and Leila arrested. John's DNA was tested, and it matched the DNA found on the cigarette butt that was at the crime scene. The leader during the actual attack itself was John, and Leila was the accomplice. However, the true mastermind behind this attack was Leila. The couple took a plea deal and received a sentence of 20 years. As for Janet Scott, her physical and psychological trauma persisted for much longer than 20 years. Her voice and eyesight never completely returned to full strength. Fortunately, though, her beloved dog, Kissy, would make a full recovery and lived a long, happy life. 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnerdys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at. And for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off, and then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is on the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen, and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up, in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location, and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time, that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point, so they dispatched people to each of these points, and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar, and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it, and when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia, and so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him, and then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety. But he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go unanswered. The next and final story of today's episode is called Waking Nightmare. In June of 1982, 38-year-old Cindy Hack divorced her husband, Roy. As soon as she moved into another home in Vancouver, Canada, she felt this wave of relief come over her. Their marriage had become abusive and toxic years ago, but her newfound happiness would be short-lived. Only 4 months after leaving her husband, Cindy's waking nightmare would begin. It all started with a late-night phone call on October 7, 1982. When she answered, the voice on the other side was raspy and angry sounding. It addressed Cindy by name and quickly told her that they planned on hurting her. And before Cindy could do anything, the caller had hung up. Cindy was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she did nothing. And then over the next few days, she received more calls from this phantom caller, and each of them began with this person addressing her by name and then threatening violence. And Cindy began to convince herself that this had to be some terrible prank, and so she continued to do nothing about it. One night, Cindy couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, and she looked into her living room and she noticed one of her windows was still open. At night, she would draw all the curtains in her house. And so she walked over to the window and she pressed her face up against the glass to look outside, and she didn't see anybody out there. And so she drew the curtains, turned around, and began walking back towards the kitchen when her phone rang. She hesitated, but eventually picked the phone up, and on the other side of the call was the mystery caller, who in a mocking tone told her that curtains weren't going to protect her, that they knew when she was home. This incident pushed her over the edge, and she knew this could not be some bad prank. This was real. And so she contacted the police, who made a house visit, but there wasn't any sign of a break-in or any sign of a crime being committed. And so after walking her property and feeling confident that she was safe, they told her that, you should really consider getting an unlisted telephone number. That way this mystery person can't keep contacting you. And so Cindy thanked them and would go on to get an unlisted telephone number. But not only would the calls continue, they would become more frequent, and in fact, the harassment in general only began to escalate. 3 days later, on October 15th, Cindy and her good friend Agnes were coming back from dinner to Cindy's house. And when they got there, they noticed that one of the front windows had been broken. And so they carefully walked onto the porch and realized the front door was actually unlocked and slightly ajar. They considered immediately leaving the property and just calling police, but they sat there for a minute and didn't hear anything inside the house, and so they decided they would just poke their head in and investigate. And so when they went inside, all the lights were off and there was no sign of a disturbance. It was totally quiet. But when they went upstairs, they found feathers all over the hall. And they followed those feathers all the way to Cindy's room. And in her room, all of her pillows had been ripped apart. And a key to her front door was laying conspicuously on her bedside table. The women fled the house and called police. But when they showed up, there really wasn't much they could do, despite knowing about Cindy's threatening phone calls she was getting. There was just no clear sign of who broke into her house and cut up her pillows. And so they told her that the best thing she can do is change her locks, make sure everything in her house stays locked at all times when she's home, and if she notices anything out of the ordinary, to call back. Over the following few days, Cindy got more threatening phone calls and began waking up to threatening notes laying on her front porch that had been made from newspaper and magazine clippings. This led to the police launching a larger investigation into the matter. An officer named Pat McBride, who had been on the force for 8 years, began checking in on Cindy almost daily. And very quickly, Pat and Cindy developed a romantic relationship, and Pat actually moved into Cindy's house while he was investigating this case. As soon as Pat moved in, the harassment seemed to stop. But just a couple of weeks later, in early November, Pat woke up one morning at Cindy's house and discovered that her phone lines were dead. When he went outside to investigate, he discovered that the lines had actually been cut, and he found a pair of wire cutters laying on the ground. Over the following month, in addition to the threatening phone calls and notes left on her porch, Cindy began hearing somebody walking around outside her house at night, but she was always too terrified to go to the window and look outside to see who it was. She began finding raw meat sitting outside of her door in the morning, and she would find pictures of dead bodies tucked under her windshield wiper on her car. One day, she walked into her backyard and she discovered 3 dead cats hanging in her garden. Cindy, who was a bubbly, happy person before the harassment started, had become a totally anxious and paranoid mess. But despite her obvious distress, the local police were starting to doubt her claims that this stalker was even real. Every time she called them claiming stalker activity, they would go to her house and look around, but they could never find any evidence to suggest that anyone besides her, her friends, or her boyfriend had been there. And speaking of her boyfriend, police officer Pat McBride, he would tell his coworkers that he was never home when the stalker called, and he never heard anybody walking around outside of her house. He said the only reason he knew about these things is because Cindy told him after the fact. Upset that the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy broke up with Pat and decided she needed to move and start over in another town. Just days before Cindy was supposed to relocate, her friend Agnes stopped by. When she went to the front door and knocked and there was no answer, she walked around to the back and she found her friend crouched down behind the stairs as if she was hiding from something. She ran over to her and noticed she had this black nylon stocking wrapped tightly around her neck, but Cindy seemed to be totally unfazed by it and just kept looking out towards her shed. And so Agnes runs over to Cindy and says, "Cindy, what are you doing? What's on your neck?" And Cindy turned to look at her and her eyes were super wide and she was panicked. And she told Agnes that just minutes ago she had been walking out to her shed to get something when a man leapt out of the shadows and wrapped this nylon around her neck and began choking her and threatened that if she turned around to look at him, he would attack her family. So Cindy and this man struggled for a minute until Agnes's car approached, which spooked the man and he ran off. Agnes was shocked and she grabbed her friend and picked her up. She pulled the nylon off of her neck and the two of them ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. And then at that point, Cindy called the police. But when the police showed up, the only evidence of this attack was Cindy's first-hand account and this nylon stocking. But the police believed the nylon stocking was Cindy's and she had staged the whole event and she had tied it around her neck herself. A few days later, in January of 1983, Cindy moved into a new home in a town called Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, Canada. And as soon as she got there, she painted her car a new color and she actually changed her last name to James. For months, she didn't see or hear from her stalker. But in October of that year, she found another dead cat on her property with a note next to it that just said, "You're next." Fearing for her life, she called the Richmond police, who set up a surveillance operation on her property. But for months, despite dozens of officers watching her house at practically all hours, they never ever saw any stalker activity. But as soon as the officers left for any amount of time, when there was a gap in surveillance, Cindy would call the police and report stalker activity. In time, this town's police department also began to suspect that Cindy was fabricating the stalker story, and they told her as much. Now, blatantly knowing the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy hired a local private detective named Ozzy Caban to look into her case. Immediately, he installed floodlights all around her property, and he gave her a two-way radio to place inside of her house that constantly broadcast back to Ozzy. That way, if she was in trouble, he would know about it even if she couldn't get to the radio to actually tell him. He also installed a panic button inside of her house that would send an alarm to him as well as to the police. In January of 1984, after only being on the case for a couple of weeks, Ozzy heard some strange sounds coming across the two-way radio. It sounded like there was some sort of struggle happening in Cindy's house, and so he tried radioing her to ask what was going on, but he didn't get a response. And so he flew over to her house, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer, and so he kicked the door down and found Cindy lying in the hallway motionless, with a note on top of her hand that was held in place by a paring knife that had been stabbed through the note and then through her hand. The note said, "You're dead, lady." Cindy also had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. And so initially, Ozzy believed Cindy was dead, but he managed to find a pulse. And so he brought her to the hospital, and when she regained consciousness, all she could recall was feeling someone inject her arm with a needle, and then after that, she had no memory of the attack. The police, believing Cindy had staged the attack, did not bother to take fingerprints at her home or on the knife or on the note. Ozzy, on the other hand, believed his client was telling the truth. He didn't believe Cindy was physically capable of injecting herself in the area where the needle had entered her body. The angle was nearly impossible to achieve on her own. Once she was released from the hospital, the police, despite believing she was lying, continued their surveillance operation of her property. But like always, nothing ever happened when any of the officers were on duty. The stalker activity only was reported after they had left. Life went on like this for over a year, and during that time, Cindy's mental health continued to decline rapidly. She lived in constant fear of this stalker, and she was deeply embarrassed that the police believed she was lying. On December 11th, 1985, Cindy was attacked again, but the details on this are incredibly scant. Someone found her lying in a ditch 6 miles away from her home. She was wearing a single work boot and a single glove. She was suffering from hypothermia and she had cuts and bruises all over her body, and she had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. She had no memory of the attack. The police told her that they believed this was yet another staged event, and so they did not do any significant follow-up. After a few days in the hospital, she was sent home, but she was terrified to be alone. So she reached out to her friend Agnes and asked if she and her husband Tom would stay with her for a couple of days, and they agreed. The first night they were there, Cindy woke up in the middle of the night and heard strange sounds coming from the basement. She woke up Agnes and Tom, and they heard the sounds too, and so they went down to the first floor, they opened up the door to the basement, and they looked downstairs, and very clearly there was a fire raging in her basement. And so Cindy immediately ran to the phone to call 911, but they discovered the phone lines had been cut. And so Tom ran outside to try to find a neighbor to call 911 for them. And when he went outside, he found a man just standing there in front of the house watching it. And Tom yelled to him, "Hey, you need to call 911. This house is on fire." And this man, without saying a word, just turned and ran down the street. And that man was never identified. Finally, Tom did get a neighbor to call 911. The fire department arrived and they put out the fire. And then after an investigation, they determined that the fire had been set intentionally. This was an act of arson. And the police said there was no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, which means someone who was already in the house had to have started the fire. And they specifically said Cindy had to have started the fire because she stages these events all the time because of this stalker delusion she has. Agnes and Tom denied this claim, saying they never heard Cindy walking around at night and she would never jeopardize their lives. After this event, Cindy became extremely depressed and had to be hospitalized, and for 10 weeks she was under intense psychiatric care. But at the end of those 10 weeks, the doctors determined that she was not a threat to herself or to anyone else, and so she was sent home. It was at this time that Cindy went to the police and said that she thinks Roy, her ex-husband, was behind all of the attacks. Police immediately brought Roy in for questioning, and he emphatically denied all allegations, saying he had nothing to do with it, and in fact, he had been the victim of this stalker that was going after his ex-wife. He said he got a number of these threatening phone calls, and one time when they called, they left him a voicemail, and he played it for the police. After speaking with Roy and confirming his various alibis, the police ruled him out as a suspect. For the next 3.5 years, Cindy continued to receive threatening phone calls and messages at her house, but no one besides Cindy ever saw this stuff happen live. While her private investigator, Ozzy, still believed every bit of her story, the Richmond Police Department had grown tired of her and stopped responding to her calls. On the evening of May 25th, 1989, Agnes showed up at Cindy's house for their scheduled game of bridge. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. And because Agnes and Cindy were very close, Agnes tried the front door, it was unlocked, and so she let herself in, thinking Cindy must be upstairs taking a shower. But when she stepped inside, the house was totally silent. And after a couple of minutes of no commotion upstairs, Agnes began searching the house for her friend, and she discovered that Cindy wasn't there, and so she called the police. The police launched a search and very quickly found Cindy's car in a parking lot at a local supermarket. And when investigators went over the car, they discovered there was blood on the outside of the driver's side door. The contents of Cindy's purse, including her credit cards and ID, were scattered about on the ground near the car. And then in the trunk of the vehicle were the groceries that Cindy had recently purchased. But despite her car being found, there was really no indication of where she went next. Her friends and family believed she had been kidnapped by her stalker, and the police believed she was staging yet another event. But regardless, no one could find her. 2 weeks after her disappearance, and 1.5 miles away from where her car had been found, a road worker had drank too much coffee and needed to use the bathroom. But where they were working, they did not have a portage on, and they were not near any local businesses that might offer public restrooms. The only area that offered any privacy was the abandoned building that was right near their worksite. And so this worker told his crew where he was headed. He turned and began walking across the totally overgrown front yard of this property. And as he began walking around the side of this building, he smelled this horrific smell, like one of the worst smells he'd ever smelled in his life. And he assumed that because this property was abandoned, Maybe people were dumping their trash on it somewhere and it's a hot day and that's why it smells. But either way, he wrote it off. He walked around to the back of this building. He found a good spot. He relieved himself. He turned around and began walking back along the side to go back to the road when he stopped, because he saw something lying near the side of the house that he was surprised he hadn't noticed on his way in. He couldn't really see what it was because the tall grass was obscuring his view, and so he took a couple steps forward to get a better look, and when he could see clearly what it was, he stopped. Because laying in front of him was a clearly deceased woman laying on her side with her hands and feet bound behind her back. And around her neck was a black nylon stocking. It was the body of Cindy James. Despite the nylon around her neck, the autopsy revealed she did not die from strangulation. She died from an overdose of morphine and other drugs. The police brought in a not expert who was easily able to put himself in the same position that Cindy was in and tie himself up. With this information, combined with their belief that Cindy was a pathological liar, they concluded that this had to have been self-inflicted, that she injected herself with the lethal dose and then dropped down to the ground and tied herself up to stage the epic conclusion to this stalker delusion. To cover their bases, the police did re-interview Roy, the ex-husband, but his alibi checked out and realistically, he was never actually a suspect. It's not listed online whether Pat McBride, the police officer ex-boyfriend, was ever investigated. While the police were very confident in their theory of what happened to Cindy, there were some discrepancies. The medical examiner did not agree with the ruling that this was a suicide. He said that you can't conclude that. There's not enough evidence. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Cindy did have an injection mark in her arm, but they could never find the needle anywhere near her body or anywhere between her and her parked car. Considering the extremely high dosage of narcotic that was found in Cindy's system, if this had been a suicide, as soon as she injected herself, she would have had to immediately shift gears, get down on the ground, and start hog-tying herself before she became too intoxicated to function, meaning the needle should have been right around where she was found, but it wasn't. Also missing from the crime scene were Cindy's shoes and socks, and interestingly, her bare feet were totally clean, despite the fact that in order to get where she was found, she would have had to cover a distance of at least 1.5 miles from her parked car. But again, there was no dirt or any markings on the underside of her feet. Also, it was strange that she wasn't discovered faster than 2 weeks. Although she was found near this abandoned house that was totally overgrown, the house was actually frequented by teenagers, and there was a walking trail nearby that would have had a line of sight on her body. These discrepancies have led many people to believe that Cindy did have a stalker, and this stalker kidnapped her in the supermarket parking lot. They tied her up, they injected her with the lethal dose of morphine, and then after she had died, they dumped her near this abandoned property right before she was found. And they had left that black nylon tied around her neck because that was the stalker's signature. Some have taken this a step further and said Pat McBride, the police officer, was behind the attacks, because he would have known when surveillance was set up on her house and could have very easily avoided detection. But the most bizarre and fascinating theory of what happened to Cindy is that she had dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This is where someone maintains at least 2 distinct personalities, and when one of those personalities is active, the other kind of fades and has no memory of this experience, creating these huge memory gaps. And so the theory goes, one of Cindy's personalities was effectively stalking herself. Or more specifically, one of her personalities hated herself and wanted to do herself harm. And so that personality would do things like stab her own hand, or run 6 miles away into some ditch and leave herself for dead. And then Cindy's other personality would take back over, and she would suddenly come to having no memory of how she became injured or how she wound up in this ditch. And so when she went to police to tell them that someone is stalking, is harassing, is attacking me, she was telling the truth. But that someone, that stalker, was actually her. She just didn't know it. But Roy, her ex-husband, was a psychiatrist. And in their 16 years of marriage, he never noticed this condition. And when Cindy was in that psychiatric ward for 10 weeks following one of her stalker attacks, none of the doctors or psychiatrists ever noticed or diagnosed her with this condition. It's still possible she had DID and it just came on later in life, and it didn't present itself enough to be noticed during those 10 weeks of psychiatric care. But realistically, this reduces the chances of DID being behind this whole thing. To date, her death is still considered a suicide, and no one has ever been charged in connection with her death. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid these mountains in fear of mysterious death, it became these Superstitious Mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself because I'm very familiar with this area. On the day he was supposed to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. Sam knew it was a bad idea to start this hike so late because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out. But he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. And so he decided he would kind of risk it and just try to go as fast as he could and use the daylight he had to reach a suitable campsite. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark, and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him. And then at one point he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting out here are treacherous. No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so as it happened, where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam intentionally did not bring a tent. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But as he's rationalizing this kind of bad gut feeling, a rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock, and immediately he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited. And so for the next 15 minutes, Sam is really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything. He doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so he begins to rationalize and convince himself that there's nothing wrong here. That feeling I have, oh, don't worry about that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way, it's something totally explainable and you got nothing to worry about. And after a little while, he convinced himself and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and he can't find his flashlight. He's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man, that's weird. I had it right here, right next to my body, and it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head, because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away, which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately, Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he knows he's not leaving this campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it, and he's not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck is out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood, so unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out, and he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next, because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching, and before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them. And it's still dark outside, and he's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind to whatever's on the other side of those trees. But he knows they're there, and they've stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees. Probably his imagination is going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees, just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved, it turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. And so when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there because he's still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car and he went in and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? So that's gonna do it, guys. Let me know in the comments. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballen podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries,